Hello and welcome to Introduction to Programming. We're going to talk today about programming the DOM. And so we're going to introduce you to the DOM, what that is, and that way you will be able to understand how do we deal with web applications, web pages, and how do we handle them programmatically using JavaScript so that we can make a page basically do whatever we want. We can slice and dice the page, whatever we want, add things, take away, move things around, change the way they look. There's a whole bunch of things that we can do to get things to work the way we want. So let's go ahead and dive right in here. What my plan is we're going to go through the presentation, then I'm actually going to switch to some code so I can show you how some of these things work. But first of all, the DOM. The DOM stands for, it's an acronym, stands for Document Object Model. And an HTML document, an HTML page is a document. So it has a structure to it, it has a hierarchy. You have tags, and then you have parent tags and child tags. So like your page starts out with an HTML tag, which is the root node element and the root tag. Then inside of that HTML root node element, you have two other elements that are children of that parent HTML element. And that is your head element, head tag, and your body element tag. So those are children of the HTML element. And then inside of those you have other elements. Like in your body you could have a P tag, H1 tags, divs, header, navs, whatever. And inside your head you have meta tags and title and script and other things that fall inside of those. So it's a hierarchical structure. And so JavaScript will allow us to have the ability to reach inside of that structure, grab it, do what we want to with it, slice and dice it any way we want based on that structure. Now, why do we care about that? Well, I've said this before in classes that you may have had with me, where I've said that in the old days, you had people that were web designers and you had people that were web developers. That was the old way. And people who are web designers didn't speak the same language as people who are web developers and vice versa. And the two kind of did their own thing, then came together and slapped an application together. That's no longer the case. If people want to be a web designer, to use that term, they need to be able to be a web developer. If people want to be a web developer, they need to be able to be a web designer. Now most people, including myself, have a bent one way or the other. For example, for me, I tend to lean towards the development programming side. My skill set and my natural ability tends to go that direction, whereas some of you out there may be bent more towards the design, you know, the images, graphics, colors, layout, CSS side of things. And my point is that if you have one bent one way or the other, you need to incorporate it into your skill set and work to develop the ability to work in that other mindset. I've had to work throughout my career to work and develop the ability to work inside the design framework. Now, I'll be honest with you, there are people out there, tons of people out there, that I'm never going to be as good at on the design side of the fence. But by doing that, what that allows me to do is we can talk the same language and understand each other. Now, the other reason why you need to do that is because in the old days, like I said, they were separate. Designers on one side, developers on the other. Nowadays, if you're going to be able to develop and want to develop modern applications, you got to know what I call the three-legged table: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. The reason why, for example, is to develop nice, modern, sharp-looking interfaces, which used to be the domain of just designers. You've got to know how to use JavaScript. In particular, there's libraries out there like jQuery UI and others that you can use to develop like accordions and tab interfaces and modal boxes and things like that, which, like I said before, used to be just the domain of designers. Now you got to know JavaScript to be able to interact and do some of that stuff. And now, why is that important? Well, what you're seeing on your screen is the reason why it's important. The more intuitive, the more user-friendly, the better your interface is. The user interface, or the modern term is more user experience. The more it's like a movie-like experience and encompassing immersive experience, the more likely customers are to do business with you. I took this information from a white paper I received a while back, where they just did a study on people doing business with internet companies and online e-commerce applications. and how likely they were with one versus the other and what percentages and all that. So as you can see from the screen, the better the experience, the more likely you are to do business. And that makes sense. That's not anything groundbreaking news there, because all of us in today's age use the internet in one shape or form or fashion, and we've all gone to pages, sites, applications where they aren't quite up to snuff, and we get frustrated with the experience and we just leave, or we abandon our shopping cart or whatever the case may be, and so we go somewhere else to another competitor to get our whatever product we're trying to order. So it's highly important that as a developer, as you're learning to program, you understand the programming that you're doing is affecting the end user. You need to put yourself in the position of the end user and understand how that works and encompasses. So I say that all to say that when we're working with the DOM, we are affecting directly the end user. If we're adding something to the page programmatically, we can have, for example, a user click on a button and all of a sudden, boom, it adds something to the page based upon that click. Those types of things. We need to think through those types of things and see the big picture so that when we're working with the DOM, we make a nice application. Now, again, to use the DOM, the Document Object Model, create experiences, I want to step back a moment and talk a little bit more about the tag elements of HTML. There are two basic types of tag elements in HTML. There's block and inline. Block means they exist on their own space. So if you don't have any CSS styling, for example, because CSS can alter the behavior of these, but if you don't have any CSS styling, anything that's a block element exists on its own line, its own row. P tags, header tags, those are the H1 through 6 tags. Div tags, those types of things exist on their own level. Now, using CSS, we can get around that. I can have two div tags side by side using CSS float, for example. But in and of themselves, take CSS out of the picture, the HTML block level tags like div exist on their own line. The opposite with inline. Inline tags, span, strong, whatever you may throw out there, there's inline tags that don't break onto their own line. Again, you can alter that with CSS, but we need to understand those two, because if we're creating, for example, we throw a P tag on the screen. P tag's a block tag. And maybe we don't want it to be a block tag. We need to have it be in columns and things. There's some things we can do with CSS to alter that. In fact, with CSS3, we can actually have it show up in columns like in a newspaper and magazine and things like that. We won't get into that in too much detail, but just know you can do that stuff. But the reason I bring it up is it's important from the programming side, because we can do things like go into the document object model, create this P block tag, and then style it in this way. And we can do all that programmatically. So, because that three-legged stool, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, all works together. So this is not an all-encompassing list and lesson on the DOM. The DOM can get quite intense as you dive into it. But I just want to introduce it to you today, and then, like I said before, show you some examples in code. So a couple of functions or methods that the document has. The document is an object, because JavaScript is an object-oriented language. So the document object, just like in other object-oriented languages, objects have methods. The document object has built-in methods. The two I want to talk about are getElement by ID and getElements by tag name. Now, when you create an HTML page, typically nowadays what you do is you use IDs and classes. Those are attributes of the tags. So I could have a P tag with the class of content. I could have a div tag with the ID of submain or something like that. You know, whatever ID you want. And you just need to know which ones you're working with tags and with IDs and classes. But usually when I'm creating a page, I'll ID and class a bunch of stuff. And the reason I do that is two things. One is I can use CSS to do whatever styling I need to do. And two, I can use JavaScript to slice and dice that page and do whatever I want with it. So the first one, ID. There's a method on the document called getElement by ID. Here's what that does. That says, and you pass through that method, by the way, in the parentheses there, you pass through that method what ID you're trying to grab. So that method basically tells the JavaScript interpreter, go into my document, my HTML document, find an ID with whatever you pass through it in those parentheses. Find that element with that ID and grab it. Typically, we store that in a variable, and then we can do other things. Like, for example, if it's an input tag, from a form, we can grab the value of that. We can adjust different attributes like the style of it and things like that with the different properties. So we can go in and grab specific elements by ID and do stuff with it. The other one there, get elements by tag name. That's a little different where we're not grabbing a specific element per se, but we're grabbing a set of HTML elements. So let's say I have a gallery of images on my page and I have like 12 image tags. I can say go into my document and get all my elements with a tag name of IMG. That's what I would put in the parentheses there. And it will go into my document, the JavaScript interpreter will go into my document, it'll grab all of my image tags that are in there based on what I tell it to grab. It'll grab all those image tags and pull it back, and these are again usually stored in a variable. It'll grab all those and return them. Now it's important to understand it returns them into an array. We have briefly spoken about arrays in the past. We haven't taken a deep dive into them. We will once we get into talking about loops and things like that. But the get elements by tag name will go in, grab all those images, bring them back into an array, and then we can do what we want to with them. Now, one other side note is a lot of times what you'll see done with these types of methods, particularly the get element by ID, is you'll say, go into my document, grab an element with an ID of such and such, and then change the content of that element to whatever I tell you. We can pass content to that element. There's different ways to do that. One of the ways we're going to use is called inner HTML, and you're going to see us do that. It's important to note, though, that inner HTML, if you go out to the W3C and you read through all the specs and things like that, inner HTML is not officially a web standard. Even though it's not officially a web standard, you see it all over the place. What the history of that property is, that was something that Microsoft came up with, and other browsers like Mozilla Firefox and Chrome and so on and so forth said, okay, we'll support that too, and they included it. There's other ways to do that within DOM methods to set the value of an element, but we're going to use some inner HTML. Just note that it's not a standard officially, but it's still in wide use. So if you ever come across that, I just note that, so if you ever come across it and they say, well, this is not a standard, it doesn't freak you out. Now the DOM, the document object model, is a tree. It's a hierarchy. Just like I said before, your HTML document is a hierarchy. You've got your HTML tag, you've got your body and head tags, and then you have stuff underneath it. It is a tree, if you think of it. So at the top, at the apex, you have your document, and then HTML, then body and head, and then whatever you have underneath that, whether it be title tags or H1s and P tags, div tags, whatever. So as you traverse the tree, quote unquote, every item, you'll hear the term used node. I'll use the term node, and you'll see it in readings and things. And so those leaves, quote unquote, on the tree, we call them nodes. And I've used this term earlier in the presentation, there are parent nodes and child nodes. For example, if you look at the picture on your screen, you have the HTML node, which is the root node. Then it is the parent of body and head. Body and head are the child nodes of HTML. Same thing with body. You have a body is the parent node of the P tag, P is the child node of the body tag. Now it's important to understand that each node has a type, okay? Because it's not simply working with the tags. We've got content within those tags, and we have attributes within those tags as well that we have to deal with in the DOM. So each node has a type. There's a document type, and that's the root one. So that one, you just are going to type document a lot, basically. And then you have elements, which are tags, HTML, body, head, H1, P, div, span, section, article, whatever. And then you also have text nodes. So if you look there at the picture, by looking at that hierarchy, I have a P tag in my body tag. Inside that P tag is a string that says, you are standing in the woods. But actually it says, you are standing alone in the woods. Inside the P tag, there is a strong tag that is wrapped around the alone. So the words "you are standing" and "in the woods" and "alone," those are text elements. Now, one side note, depending on the browser you're using, typically IE handles things, goes off and does their own thing. But if you have an empty space, you see around P tags, there's quotes around that. Sometimes you will have to deal with those empty spaces. IE is getting better. With each new release, they get better and more standardized. So, because the other browsers, you don't usually have to deal with those spaces. But just to keep that in mind, if you ever go in and say, give me the text node, and they're returning information to you that's empty, that's something to keep in mind, and if you know stuff is there. And so you can grab text nodes out of your DOM, change that text node and whatever. So by looking at that hierarchy, the text node "you are standing," its parent is the quote, which is in the P tag in the body. So it's important to understand that, because some people, it's easy for some people anyway to say, okay, I understand the hierarchy with the tags, but they forget about that the text is actually part of the document object model. And then inside of there is also the attributes. So if my P tag, for example, it doesn't show it in here, but if my P tag had a class attribute on it, that's a node. That's a node type, an attribute, and we can affect that as well. So we can basically grab anything and affect anything we want on our page. So again, you'll hear the term traversing the tree or climbing the tree used a lot in talking about the DOM, the document object. There are tons of methods and properties that we can use to traverse that tree. I've already shown you two of them, get element by ID and get elements by tag name. Get element by ID is used a ton. You will use that a lot in here, and you will see it a lot when you look at code out there on the web. Now there's properties I wanted to point out to you about the DOM. The node value property. So you grab a particular node, you can grab that value, whatever is stored, that information that's within that node. Does not include the elements of tag names. This will be like you're grabbing an attribute, for example. You can either find out or set the value of the attribute of a node, like the class. You could change the class on the fly with of a particular element. Node type. If you are maybe looping over, traversing it, and you need to find out what types of nodes you're working with, you can. You can say, is this a text node, is it an element node, attribute node, and so on. So you can get that information back. It returns it in a number, like text is 3, elements 1. Those are typically the two you look for if you're using that, and to find out whether it's text or an element. Occasionally maybe an attribute, but typically those two. So you say, you know, hey, is this a 3 or is this a 1? Is this text or is this element? And then child nodes is another property, so that you can go in and grab the children of an element. It returns it in an array, so because an element may have a bunch of children, like you may have an article tag, the element, the inside of that article tag has several P tags. You know, let's say 5 paragraphs. Well, it has 5 children, and so you can grab all of those children and child nodes, bring them back, and it pulls it back in the array, and you can traverse over that. And then there's properties of first child and last child. So that simply does what it sounds like. It grabs the first child and the last child of an array. So in those 5 paragraphs I mentioned just a moment ago, it would grab the first paragraph would be first child, and the last child would be the last paragraph. Okay, it allows you to grab and manipulate things. But one of the takeaways I want you to understand and start solidifying in your brain is the document object model, the DOM. Just like any object in object-oriented programming, there are methods, there are properties, and we can change structure and content and all that. But by doing so, we still maintain standards by doing that. So we can manipulate things any way we want and still have a valid W3C document. I want to talk about some of these in more detail, like node value. You'll use that more often, and I'll show you in some code. But it allows you to grab the value and, like I said before, and even set the value of a node. So in my example here, I have document.getElement by ID, some ID. So first, let me stop right there and explain what's happening. I'm telling JavaScript, go into my document, find and get an element with the ID of some ID. So I have a P tag or whatever that on my code that has the ID of some ID. Then note we're using, the periods are important. If I haven't said this before, we're using dot object notation is what that's called. The periods separate properties from methods from objects. So we got the document object, period, with the dot object notation, get element by ID method, period, and then the property here. So we have get element by ID, it's grabbing our sum ID, and then we're saying grab the first child that's in there. So whatever that ID is, let's say it's a div tag, we're saying go inside that div tag that has the ID of sum ID, grab the first child, maybe it's a p tag. Grab the first child, and then bring back the value of that first child. And so we can get that value, or we can set that value. Okay. Now, just a word of caution. When you are manipulating this data and you're changing values, test, test, and test again, because you want to make sure that you're not ending up with weird results. So if you're going into a div tag that has 5 paragraphs and you're changing that data, you don't want to create incoherent text inside your 5 paragraphs. You want it to make sense, so you got to make sure you do that. And I'm going to show you a way to do that. We're going to actually do it in this way. I'm going to go in and I'm going to use a method called remove child, where I'm saying go in and remove all the children from this node. That's one way you can pull that and create a new one. Then we can use a method called create text node, where we can create new content on the fly. Okay, now this is a little different than inner HTML that you'll use. Inner HTML, you can create tags and stuff like that and put structure on there. Create text node, you can't do that. It has to be text. Okay, you have to create text with that. Now, the next thing is appending content. We can use a method called append child, where we can take new content and put it in, and so we can just simply add content. Like if we have 5 paragraphs in our div tag and we want to add a new paragraph, we can do that. Okay. There's certain steps in how to do this, and I'll walk you through the code so you can see the example. Styles. Again, the 3-legged stool that I've talked about plenty of times. CSS, you can't have a good application without CSS either, because that's what brings some of the pizzazz and layout, and in some cases functionality, to your application. Well, we can of course write CSS, but we can access CSS programmatically using JavaScript, so we can access stylings via the DOM. The DOM has a style property. We can access that class actually with a class name property, and we can change the look and feel of our site. We can say go into this this div tag and set the class name to whatever we want, and we can change it on the fly. We can also do some things, some other style things. You can access pretty much any styling. I can't think off the top of my head what styling I haven't been able to access, but I probably haven't tried to access every single one of them, because there's thousands of them. But we can access virtually anyone, like visibility. Some of you may have been on applications before where you are working on an application, you click on a button and something shows up on your page or something like that. One of the ways, there's many ways to do that, one of the ways that might be done is using the style class with a visibility property. So you have here, go into my document, grab my element with the ID of some ID, and go into the style of that and change the visibility of that style to visible, to have it show up. Now, as you go through this semester, you'll learn more and more techniques and tips, and I'll show you more and more of those about how to debug and things, and you'll get practice on debugging. Every product I've ever built has bugs in it, and that's going to be true of you as well, because we're human. We make mistakes. Things don't work the way we want. We forget a curly brace or parenthesis or whatever. Well, when you're manipulating the DOM, it can get complex pretty quickly. So we've got to be able to fix any bugs that we come across. Now, I've already shown you alerts. Of course, you can use document writes and breakpoints. Let me show you another one. You can use the DOM itself, and I'm going to show you this when we go through the code. You can use the DOM itself to tell you what's happening to the page, and I'll show you an example of that. Because we can use a method called create element, And not just with debugging, we can use that method to create anything we want on a page, but we can use that to create HTML code and then use the append child method to add to it. Of course, you can use Firebug as well, and I'll show you that. So let's go ahead and let's dive into our code here. And let me show you what's happening. Let me make this a touch bigger. Okay, here's our first one. We've got this stick figure adventure. What this is, I don't know if any of you ever read these as a child. It was like a choose your own adventure books. When I was a kid, I had some of those. You read something, at the end you got to choose what decision you wanted to make, and then it told you to go to a specific page based on that decision. This allowed you to read a book over and over again and get different outcomes. Well, this is similar. So here I have my stick figure adventure. I can click a button here, button 1, your journey begins at the fork in the road. Do I take a path, take a bridge? All this is an image and some buttons here that I can click on and travel through my story. Let's take a look at the actual code. So here I have normal HTML, head and body tags and title. I have some script. Let me go down to the HTML first, and then we'll come back to see what the script does. In my body tag, it's pretty simplistic. I just have a div tag, has some inline stylings on it. On a side note, I would stay away from those as much as possible, but in this case, it's pretty minimal styling. And then inside there, I have an image tag, which is just my image. So this image right here, that little sticky note there. And then inside out there, I also have a div tag with an ID. Notice how these things are ID'd already, scene image and scene text. So we'll be able to use getElementById to change some things. And then I have a couple buttons. Those also have IDs on them, and those have an onClick built into them, so that when I click it, it's calling a change scene function, and it's passing to it button numbers 1 and number 2. So let's go into the code here in the JavaScript part of it, and let's see what's happening. First thing is, we have a variable called curScene, current scene, and it's set to 0. I've talked about this in the past. When you instantiate variables, many times it's a good practice to instantiate it with a beginning value so you know where you're starting. So in this case, I have a current scene 0, which is tells me, okay, I'm starting step 1 right here. When I go into the page, the value of my variable is going to be curScene equals 0. Because we're going to change it as we go along to know where we're at and keep track of where our end user is at through our little story here. So then I have the function change scene, which is being called from my buttons. Change scene 1, change scene 2. And so I have this function change scene. I'm passing to that function. We'll get in more detail on the functions later on, but I'm passing to that function number 1 and number 2, as you saw when you looked at my button code. So what it's basically doing is sort of like a variable, but in this case they're called function parameters, where I'm saying, okay, I want to pass the value 1 or the value 2 to my function. That value, whether it be the number 1 or the number 2, gets stored in this word decision. Whatever I put in there, I could put in whatever I wanted in there. I could put foo in there and it would store it in there. So it's storing in this variable decision. Now I can use that as a variable within my code, and you'll see me do that here. Then inside my function, I have a local variable here, message, which we start off as blank. Okay. Then I'm using a switch statement. Now, just to refresh in case we don't recall what a switch statement is, or to make sure everyone's on the same page, all a switch statement does, it's similar to an if statement, but it's a little just different syntax. We're saying we want to test something. So in this case, our switch statement is testing the variable current scene, curScene, which starts off with a value of 0. So we're testing that, whatever the value of that is. Our case statements, and sometimes these are called switch case statements for obvious reasons, but our case statements is a lot like an if statement. So in this say we're saying, in case this is 0, do this stuff. Lines 15 and 16. So it's like an if statement. In other words, if this is 0, do this stuff. Now you may wonder, well, why would we do a switch statement, not an if statement? Sometimes if you have several choices, if else, and if else ifs can become complex with nested. You're going to do some of that stuff, but in this case it's easier with a switch statement. So we have, okay, we're switching, we're testing a current scene. First thing we're saying, if it's 0. If it's 0, we're then going to set the current scene to the value equal to 1. And then we're going to set the value of our message local variable to your journey begins at the fork in the road. So if I go back and I click my button, because its current scene was 0, it says now, here's my message, your journey begins at the fork in the road. And I'll show you how that gets put on the page, how it gets from here on line 16 to here on the page. Okay? And also will show you how this changed, the image changed. But right now the value of our current scene is your journey begins at the fork in the road. So the first time we go through, it says changes current scene value to 1, your journey begins at the fork in the road. I want to talk briefly about this break line here. What that tells it is when it hits that line, it stops and breaks out of my switch statement. So it doesn't keep testing, in this case 1 and 2 and so forth. It stops, it says, okay, we came in here and jumped inside here because current scene was equal to 0. Hit break, stop the code from running, jump outside your switch statement and go all the way down to here where the switch statement ends with this curly brace right here. Okay. Now, there's several things, they're all basically testing the same thing. We have, we're testing current scene each time with 0, 1, 2, 3, and so forth. When we get down here to the bottom, is where we're updating our text and our image. We're using getElementById. Remember I said that we ID'd scene image and scene text here. So we're saying go into our document, grab the ID of the element scene image, grab that element with the ID of scene image, and change the source attribute. It starts off at scene0.ping. Change that source attribute to scene, and we're using concatenation plus a number, whatever our current scene was. Remember 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. And then ping. See, we have in our directory here in our site, we have a bunch of images that are all consistently named. Scene0.ping, scene1.ping, scene2.ping, and so forth. So as our current scene value changes, we're able to change the image using just simple concatenation there. So then we change that. We are also updating the text using inner HTML. We're saying go in and grab our element with the ID of scene text, that's this div there, and put the message in inside of there, inside of that HTML. So let's walk through this here. We've got journey, let me refresh it here. I click 1, our journey begins at the fork in the road. Okay, I click 1 again, you've arrived at a cute little house in the woods. Let's see what happens there, why that showed up. Again, as we go through here, remember we can pass through this decision. Am I clicking button 1 or am I clicking button 2? So we're testing what the current scene is here on the switch statement. If it was 0, change the current scene value to 1, your journey begins to fork in the road. Next time it came through, the value of current scene was set to 1. So the first time this switch statement ran, it said, does it equal to 0? No, it does not. So it says, does it equal to 1? Yes, it did. So then we run this if-else statement. If decision is equal to 1, so if they click the 1 button, then do this code in here, change the current scene value to 2, you've arrived at a cute little house in the woods. You've arrived at a cute little house in the woods, and we change the ping and stuff based upon the current scene value. If I would have clicked button 2, this else statement would have run. It would have changed my current scene to 3 and said, you're standing on a bridge overlooking a peaceful stream. Let's test that and see if it works. So I click a button. Last time I picked number 1, I arrived at a cute little house in the woods. This time I picked 2, I'm standing on a bridge overlooking a peaceful stream. Okay. And so that's all we do as we go through here. We're testing is our current scene 2, then we can, if they pick button 1, do this, else do the other one because they picked button 2. Is the current scene 3, did they choose button 1 or choose button 2. And that's simply how we're creating this as we go through to create our little application. So that's slicing and dicing the DOM. You can do some really cool things with this as you go through and learn how to put all this stuff together to create an application. Now, let's add to our application here a little bit. Let's go to version 6. That was version 5. Let me make it bigger. And in version 6, let me change that version. We're going to add a little bit to it. Same code as before, except we come down here, we added a while statement down here. And here's what we're doing. If I click this here, it works the same, as you can see, as we're going through. The little application, but we changed it to make use of the DOM. Right here is all we added. In this case, we're saying in that variable scene text, which remember I said that sometimes we store this element information, get element by ID in variables to manipulate it. See, back on version 5 we didn't. On version 6 we added this piece here to this line. We're saying go into our document, get our element with the ID of scene text, store that in our scene text variable. That allows us to do things with that element because we can reference that variable, and that's exactly what I'm doing here in the while statement. I'm saying my scene text, which is that paragraph, or it's this div tag, I should say, go into there, that div tag, grab the first child. Well, the first child is the text, because remember we're dealing with text as a node, so when I click this button here, this, your journey begins at the fork in the road, which is our message text, is the first child. So I grab that, and so actually I'm not grabbing the first child. What I'm doing is I'm saying while that first child exists, okay, if there's a first child in there, so while that's true, because that will return true or false based upon whether there's a child in there or not. And then in that scene text, call the method removeChild and remove that first child, passing that to it. Then in that scene text, that div tag, append the child, so we're going to add to it document create text node message. See, we're not using this inner HTML anymore. We remove that. We're saying go into our scene text div, append a child to it, and that child is going to be a text node, and that text node value is going to be the message that we add to it. So it's a very similar way to do it. It's just in this case we are using not the non-standard inner HTML, but the standard create text node. Okay, let's continue and go to our version 7. Version 7, we've changed our buttons down here a little bit. Click Start Game. Okay. So take a bridge, gaze into the stream, jump in the stream to be continued. So we've changed the way it looks and feels here just a little bit. First thing we did was I have some styles in there. If this were a production app, I'd put those in their own CSS file, but for the sake of keeping everything concise into one file, it's here. So I have that here. Then we have a function called replace node text. I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. We have the same change scene function before, and up here I forgot to mention the same current scene variable. And then we come down here, we got the same change get element by ID, we're changing our image. But then we have this replace node text function we're calling. So instead of doing this while statement over and over again, trying to be more efficient, we created a replace node text, and what we're doing is we're calling that and we're saying, okay, in the scene text div here, this ID, change the message. In the decision1 ID, this button, we're passing through it a variable decision1, decision2, pass through it a variable decision2, and we're replacing that text. That's what allows the words on these buttons to change, and of course this message to change. let's see how that replace node text works. Scroll back up here. So this function, we're passing to it two parameters: the ID of the parameter, scene text or decision 1, decision 2, and whatever text we're passing through it. In this case, we're passing to it variables that hold the text. And those variables are here on line 28, the message, and decision 1, decision 2. We had this before, the message in there. We added decision 1 and decision 2, take the path, take the bridge. So based on what button they click and what the number is of the current scene, we just simply change the value of the text that's stored in message, decision 1, decision 2. So we use those variables. Down here we pass those variables to the replace node text function so we can pass that text right through it. So then up here we're passing the ID of whatever we want to change and the text that we want to change. Inside there we have a local variable called node, and we're saying go into our document, grab our element with the ID of whatever ID we pass it. Scene text, decision 1, decision 2. Then we have a while statement. We've grabbed that element right here and stored it in the node variable. So we're saying that node first child, this is the same, similar to what the code was we had before here in version 6 right here. So we're saying while our node first child, while it has a first child, first thing we want to remove it, and then we want to append a child by creating text, and we pass to it the new text that we're creating, which is housed in this parameter, which it comes from either message, decision 1, or decision 2 text. So we're making it a little more object oriented. This is kind of meaty if you're just starting this. So I would spend some time playing with this. This is out of chapter 8. Spend some time playing around with it. Mess with some of this code down here to make some changes so you can see how the flow of information works. Okay, the 8th version here. Let's go to that one here. Okay, in this case, notice how now I'm doing something where as I hover over, it's changing my buttons. So what I do here is I have some styling where I have some styling with the class of decision or decision hover. I still have the current scene variable. I still have the replace node text function. I still have the change scene. Scroll down here. I still have the get element by ID here for the image changing, the replace node text. We're changing the text. We have the image and everything. All we did here was we added an on mouse over and on mouse out, where we're saying go into this. Whenever you see this, that's always context dependent. So in this case, I'm saying this element. So go into this element, which happens to be this span tag. Now, we changed the tags, just so you're aware. Sometimes you'll see buttons like this. We changed them from buttons on version 5 and 6 to span tags here, and we added a class decision for our styling and stuff, just so you're aware. You could do this with buttons and things as well. But we have this span tag over, and we're saying this element, this span tag, when I hover over it, when I put my mouse over it, change this span tag's class name to decision hover. So it starts off as decision, change it to decision hover. When our mouse goes out, change this span tag's class name back to decision. We do that on both of them. That's what allows this functionality to happen. Now, version 9. Let's go ahead and take a look at that one. Notice here, if I go back to version 8, I have this little button here. That's because it's as it started off, button 2 didn't have any content in it when we started our game. That kind of looks ugly. So what we're doing here is we're going to remove that and then have button 2 show up. Here's how we did that. Of course, we have our stylings. Our code is just like before throughout all this decision making stuff. to our switch case statement. Same thing. Here's what we did though. We have on the second span tag, we have a style visibility hidden. So it starts off, it doesn't show up. When we add information to that, we need to change that visibility so that when information shows up in there, we can actually see it. We do that up here inside this change scene function, because we know they've clicked on something at that point and they've gone to another page, and we now have data in that decision to span tag choice. So here, if you look, right here I've got the comment show second decision. I'm saying go into our document, grab an element with the ID of decision 2, change the style of that element, the visibility property, change it to visible. It was hidden before. We don't have to do that anywhere else because they've already, that's their first choice. So now it'll always show up. So that's what allows that to not be there, and then once we click on something, for the visibility to be there. Lastly, our last iteration here, our version 10. Let me show you this. Okay, same stuff as before, and as I start, you see what's happening down here. I'm actually writing to the page here. This is referencing what I said in my presentation about having the DOM kind of debug itself and creating elements on the fly, and so you see what's happening. If I go into version 10, let me scroll all the way to the bottom here. I have a new div tag with an ID of history that starts off as empty. Well, what we did was we added, all the other stuff's the same, we added this code here. So we start off with a variable of history. We're saying go in our document, get an ID, element with the ID of history, which is our div tag, grab that, store it in our history variable. If our current scene is not equal to 0, so if the current scene is not equal to 0, we know they've chosen something, they've clicked on a button, a span button, then we're going to add that information to our history. We have a variable of decision element, that's just what I called it. Go into our document, create an element, p tag. Store it here in the decision element. Then in that decision element, which is housing our p tag, append a child to that element, and the child we want to append that to that element is a document text node. So create a text node. We're using concatenation. That's decision, and we're just using our decision variable that we passed. That's the same one we used way up here for our change scene. So our same variable. So decision whatever, and then we are also using scene whatever our current scene value is and the message is. So when you create an element, so on line 160, we created a p tag and stored it in decision element, but that tag was just kind of hanging out there. We didn't put it anywhere yet. Then we appended a child to that. We created a text node on line 161 and concatenated both hard-coded text and variables into that text node. And then when you create a text node, it's kind of hanging out there. We got to tell it where to put it. We told it put it inside of our p tag by using the append child method. But now we have this p tag hanging out there with text node inside of it. We got to tell it where to put it. So go into our history variable, which is housing our history div, and append the child to that of the decision element. So put the p tag inside of our history element. So as we click on things and that keeps running, we'll build up p tags inside this history div tag. So as I click, decision 1, scene 1, your journey begins at fork in the road. I'm going to take the path. Decision 1, that's the button I chose. Scene 2, you've arrived at a cute little house in the woods. Knock on a door. Decision 2, so I clicked on the second button. Scene 5, sorry, a witch lives in the house and you just became part of her stew. I start over. So I hope this has been beneficial for you. I've thrown a lot at you. But I want you to play with this code, spend some time getting to know how this works. Feel free to ask me any questions you come across. But there's real power when you start to understand how the DOM works together and how you can grab elements, slice and dice, and have things show up and disappear and create, and it really becomes a creative process at its root as you're programming, because you can change colors and really create an immersive user experience for the end user. So thank you very much, and happy coding.